welcome and good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everybody for joining this session. I'm going to just give a few words about the background to this conference, and particularly for those of you who may not be familiar with Gobeshona. Gobeshona is a Bangla word for research, and it is the word that we chose to name a platform of research organizations and universities in Bangladesh 7 years ago that we set up to bring together researchers working on different aspects of climate change, particularly on adaptation. And amongst the many things that we do, which I won't describe in detail, we ran an annual conference every January at my university, the Independent University of Bangladesh in Dhaka, where we had several hundred people join for 4 days with quite a few international participants as well in a traditional in-person conference format. Uh, we did get quite a few international people, but they had to fly into Dhaka to participate. And several of the people on this call have done that in the past. This year, because of the pandemic, we decided to go online and make it a virtual event. But we also chose or tried to make a virtue of it being virtual and reach out to our friends around the world and invite them to do sessions around the world. So not only is it a virtual, it's a global conference now, not just a Bangladeshi one. And the theme we chose is locally led adaptation, which is something that's very close to our heart. In fact, last year at the physical conference in Dhaka, the theme of locally led adaptation coming out of the Global Commission on Adaptation was formally launched by Mr. Ban Ki-moon. And since then, we've all been working, particularly everybody on this call, have been working very closely together and come up with the principles as part of that. So just to let you know that this, when we did the call and invitation, we got an overwhelming response. And as a result, we ended up with 90 sessions, and we're running them 24 hours a day for 7 days. And today is the 6th day we are running it. We've already done 5 24-hour cycles. We have an 8-hour segment for the Asia Pacific, and then an 8-hour segment for the Africa and European time zones, and then another 8-hour segment for the Central America, North America, South America time zone. And our South American friends do theirs in Spanish. And then we start again from the Asia Pacific, and we've been around the world 24 hours for the last 6 days. One more round to do, and we end this time tomorrow will be the last. And we have got an overwhelming response, discussions, participation. And essentially what we're trying to do is to link up local level actors around the world, local level adaptation people doing stuff in different countries in Asia and Africa, Latin America. Yesterday evening, I had a very good conversation with the resilience officer of Rhode Island State in the United States, who are doing some interesting stuff and quite similar to things that are happening in other parts of the world. So finally, what the decision that we have made is that we will retain this virtual format going forward. And so this is now the first of the new series. It's the 7th of the old Gobeshona conferences, but it's now the first of the new global Gobeshona conference on locally led adaptation. And we'll hold it in the last week of January every year going forward. And I invite everyone who's participating in this to come back every year, join us on this. I'm calling it a 10-year journey to promote locally led adaptation over the next 10 years to 2030. And hopefully we can all join forces, learn from each other, share what we're doing, and be more effective as a result of actually helping the poorest people on the planet adapt to the impacts of climate change. I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Cristina.
Thank you, Salim. That's really exciting and really great to hear. And while I personally would wish I was in Dhaka at the moment, it was wonderful to be there with you last year. But still, the hospitality is there, the warm welcome is there, and moving to a virtual format gives us a lower carbon footprint and higher participation. So it's worth the trade-offs that are there. So just to say thank you, Salim, for your leadership on this issue, for welcoming us and for convening the session here today. We're going to be talking about the principles for locally led adaptation, and we'll get into those in just a second. But I do want to acknowledge that this was something that was very much developed at last year's Gobeshona conference and launched formally by Secretary Ban Ki-moon at Gobeshona last year via a video message. But the journey really starts much earlier than that. If you wouldn't mind putting up the slides again, Emma. We started really with some foundational research that was done by colleagues from IIED, some of whom are on this call today, that was looking at the amount of funding that is getting down to the local level, or the amount of climate funding that is getting down to the local level as best we know it, and found some disturbing results from this. I think it's a 2017 paper that really found that only 10% of funds are earmarked for local level climate action. And who knows how much of that is actually getting down to the local level. There's been, next slide, there's been growing attention to this, growing analysis, and really significantly growing political commitment. I'd say really starting with the LDC group coming forward with its 2050 vision, which has several asks of the international community, but also commitments and offers to the international community, including a very strong commitment to develop a strong climate finance architecture with at least 70% of the funding flows supporting local level action by 2030. The Global Commission on Adaptation, which was launched in September of 2018, picked up on this and really through the leadership of two commissioners, Mohammed Musa and Sheila Patel, have developed an action track on locally led action. And over the past year, it's really momentum. Sorry, next slide, Emma. And the action track has made a commitment to mobilize greater funder and government commitments to supporting expanded locally led adaptation. And that commitment and momentum has just built and built over the last year. Here are a couple of the exciting reports that have come out in the past several months, really, that look at the need to have more locally led finance, to have more local leadership investment in that local leadership for climate action, for humanitarian response, for peace building as well. Next slide. So that has brought us to where we are today on the eve of the Climate Adaptation Summit, which will be held next Monday and Tuesday, where the locally led action track has set out a number of commitments to expand the quantity, but more importantly, in some ways, the quality of funding for locally led adaptation action, developed a framework for locally led action, and specifically a set of principles to guide good practice on locally led adaptation. And these are principles that are not just for donors, they're not just for implementers, they're really for everyone who has a role to play in supporting adaptation at the local level. It is an articulation of how we change from the business as usual, where the funding doesn't necessarily get down to the local level, or where it's not prioritized and led and empowering local actors, to a business unusual approach. So the Commission has really sought to amplify these principles, develop them, and get political commitment against them, and they will be launched on Tuesday at the Climate Adaptation Summit. Next slide. They've been developed through over a year's worth of work and a number of different consultations and research and analysis, including bilateral consultations, supported grassroots organizations to do internal consultations of their constituencies to ensure that what we're putting forward really does meet the needs of those organizations, of those grassroots constituencies, a number of group consultations, and a locally led action track partners call, which met bi-monthly and has about 100 members to discuss these principles, to get feedback, to share information, and to learn from each other. And you'll see there a snapshot of the different events where consultations were held, including Gobeshona last year, right around this time. Next slide. And to tell us a little bit more about what do we mean by locally led action, what is it, what is it, what is it not, is Marek from IIED, who's going to walk us through the principles themselves and give us a preview of them. Marek, over to you.
Thanks, Cristina. So perhaps before I just get straight into the principles, just giving a bit of a sense of what we've been talking about as locally led adaptation action. We've been thinking about it in terms of where local benefits accrue, so below the lowest administrative structure within a country, really promoting benefits, so building resilience and adaptation to climate change within communities, households, and individuals that are sharing common shocks and stresses, but crucially, not just thinking about the benefits and where they accrue, but that it's really locally led. So that local people, households, and communities have more individual and collective agency over their own development and their adaptation to be able to be better prioritise and implement solutions. But also thinking about this in terms of a whole of society response. You might have heard that phrase that's being picked up by Anne-Marie Trevelyan around promoting solutions, not just from the public sector, but also from local private sectors, whether that be small enterprises in different sectors that are crucial to many developing countries' economic sustainability and to build their resilience, but also local civil society, so that'd be grassroots organizations, social movements that are really trying to promote more people-centered solutions. So next slide, please. And as Cristina has alluded to, based on the research that we've been doing in collaboration with many organizations on this call, it's the purpose of the principles, which I'll go through in a moment, is really to try and address the problem of the current climate finance, but also development and humanitarian landscape. The fact that we have this problem that is incredibly interconnected of nature, poverty, and climate change. But the fact that many of the solutions that are being proposed and the funding being put forward to develop solutions across the board are often not prioritized by the people and the places that need it most. And Cristina alluded to some research around the finance and where it's going and where it's getting stuck, and that it appears that the vast majority is not getting down to locally led, people-centered approaches. Next slide, please. I think we'll just skip to the next slide. Thank you. So I'm just going to take you through, I just have 8 minutes to go through the 8 principles, so it's not much time, so a minute per principle to give you a whirlwind tour of what will be launched at the CAS on Tuesday. But I guess just to say it's great to present these principles at the end of 2 years of collaborative work with not just WRI and IIED, but a whole range of organisations. Many of you here today, but over 50 organisations that have engaged in the workshops, the consultations, from CBA to Gobeshona last year, to Money Where It Matters events, to the London Climate Week, all events going on. And to say that as we present some of the ideas that have come out of all these consultations, that are trying to represent what business unusual adaptation may look like, moving from the current status quo that we're seeing, is to try not to think about any of these principles in isolation. Many of them interact with one another. And what we are wanting to see is institutions trying to do more of this business as usual, that even institutions like ourselves, IIED, we try to promote local adaptation, but even we are trying to do better by put forwarding an endorsement. And to see that many of these principles are also not just unique to local action, but unique to trying to do better development overall, but starting with trying to, in this first principle, devolve more decision-making as low as possible where it is appropriate, to empower those worst impacted by climate change to lead on more adaptation, to increase the financial flows to local actors where possible, and where locally led adaptation is not the best level at which decision-making should take place. It's to ensure that these local actors, local people and communities have a real genuine voice in helping design and prioritize, monitor and evaluate what happens. Next slide, please. The second slide, and just to say this has been actually updated yesterday to draw your attention to that, is around really ensuring that the most excluded and marginalized people are put at the front of leading on adaptation. So women, youth, children, disabled, displaced, indigenous people and marginalized ethnic groups are given more voice and control in the adaptation that is important for them. So engaging with the structural, economic and political inequalities that underpin the risks that they face, providing these excluded groups with more decision-making power, but also more streams of adaptation and other sources of finance so they can lead their own adaptation initiatives. Next slide, please. And principle 3 is around the terms of the finance that we're hoping to see a shift towards. So currently, it's what we often see is funding is very projectized, provided over very short time periods. And what we hope to see through more business unusual climate financing, development financing, humanitarian financing, is funding provided over a long enough timescale, so over 7 years, hopefully, to enable more investment in local institutions, local capacities. And that doesn't just end suddenly and there's no sustainability to those interventions and it's impossible and have to go back to business as usual at the local level. But that funding is also predictable, that it's able to, allows local actors to actually take the risks to change their behavior, to allow them to become more resilient. Having predictable funding year on year is incredibly important for local actors to change their behavior. And that financing to the local level is also more simple to access than it currently is. The incredibly hard and challenging requirements, for instance, from the Green Climate Fund at the moment, but it's much more simple and recognises the often the local actors may not have the capacities that align totally with the donor-driven proposal or funding development processes, and proactively actually try and seek to address the structural capacity imbalances that exist in the current aid system. Next slide, please. And principle 4, linked to that previous one, is around investing in local capabilities to really leave an institutional legacy. So trying to actually use adaptation funding in collaboration with other sources to build the capabilities of local actors and local institutions so they can lead on adaptation. Strengthening existing local institutions where they exist, so that might be local government, the local grassroots organisations that are providing resources to local communities. It might be the local enterprises, local private sector organisations. To helping them to create the new structures where necessary so they can really lead on adaptation. And this includes building the capabilities and capacities to understand climate risk and its uncertainty, to be able to generate and facilitate and manage adaptation, strengthening their fiduciary, we hear this word from big climate funds, to really actually strengthening their fiduciary capacities so they can manage the money, provide grants and loans and financial instruments that are really suitable and predictable for local communities to invest in their resilience. Next slide, please. Principle 5 is about building a more robust understanding of climate risk and uncertainty. And it's trying to get away from the current business as usual that often leads to the overuse of top-down climate models that are often not suitable for really building robust adaptation measures that are robust to the incredibly uncertain future that we face. So trying to commence more adaptation from local, traditional, indigenous peoples and generational knowledge, using more bottom-up climate resilience assessment, adaptation planning that builds some of this knowledge that they have and the resilience pathways that are suitable for them, and integrates this local, generational, indigenous knowledge with the appropriate scientific information to test how well their chosen adaptation options or their chosen adaptation pathways will perform under the very uncertain climate futures that we all face. And really proactively trying to work with the uncertain climate conditions into the future rather than being scared of that uncertainty and not thinking about it at all. So next slide, please. Principle 6 is around more flexible programming and learning, but really importantly, the funding has to match this intent to be flexible and promote adaptive management. So the funding allows this flexibility to happen, recognizing that adaptation, after all, is a learning process. It's impossible to design a perfect adaptation or resilience measure. It is incredibly important to learn from how that adaptation or resilience measures perform, to integrate that learning and improve it over time. Recognize that we do not have perfect knowledge on the societies, the political economies, the climate that we are designing and implementing these adaptation measures in. So the finance needs to really enable this iterative learning and adjustment to take place. And I guess we're seeing today, being at Gobeshona, the attempts to promote this iterative learning and adjustment with this first event of the learning journey. And events like that, I hope, are going to be really crucial to helping this flexible and iterative programming and adaptation to take place. Next slide, please. The penultimate principle, Principle 7, is on ensuring transparency and accountability in adaptation and other sources of financing, recognizing really that we don't actually know, as Cristina alluded to, how much climate finance or adaptation finance actually gets to the local level. So it's really important to have that knowledge so that donors, governments, other financial intermediaries are actually letting everyone know in the public and local communities how they plan to govern and finance local adaptation and where that funding is actually going to be decided upon, giving local actors an opportunity to be involved in this decision making, but also involved in monitoring and evaluation and learning to feed back what is actually working, and really prioritizing downward accountability rather than accountability upwards towards the holders of the finance. And final slide, please. And the final principle is about more collaborative action and investment. And I'm sure this is one that we always hear about, the need to collaborate and coordinate funding streams better. But I guess it's just to reiterate, this is incredibly important, especially with new sources of funding coming on board, like the new UK commitment, 3 billion for nature, or the new COVID green recovery funds that are flowing into many countries. And obviously all these sources of funding are inherently, hopefully, addressing some development deficits, ecosystem deficits, and helping build resilience in different ways. So it is another attempt to really try and ensure that we are trying to coordinate and converge these sources of funding to address the real needs that local people, local actors, local communities need, coordinating different sources, humanitarian funding, public health, funding for livelihoods and agriculture, so it's addressing the collective needs that they have. And then in the climate finance system, ensuring that all the different sources of the complex climate finance landscape that we operate in is coordinating with one another, so it can provide funding that is simpler for local actors to address and addressing their different needs. So that hopefully gives you a snapshot, a very whirlwind tour of all the different principles. And we do at IIED have an issue paper that Cristina presented in an early slide coming out next week around the launch of the principles that will provide some additional examples of different institutions and projects and programs that are seeking to do more business unusual aligning with this. So we can hopefully share that with all of you on this call next week when it's launched. But back over to Cristina, who I think is going to introduce the panel.
Thanks, Marek. Hopefully that was a useful preview of the principles. We're very happy to have a number of different panelists joining us here today. Oops, I think that's the wrong slide, Emma. Don't worry, you can just take the slides off. We'd rather focus on the panelists because we have a very diverse set of speakers joining us, and thank you all for joining us on a Saturday. And what we have is a number of speakers who have endorsed the principles. We're proud to say we have 40 organizations endorsing them that will be launched, recognized at the summit next Tuesday at a dedicated event on locally led adaptation. But today we get a sneak preview and really hear in a little bit more detail why they're endorsing the principles, what it means to them and their organizations, including private sector organizations, governments, and what are some of the challenges that are anticipated, because this is not easy work. If it were easy, people would be doing it already, and we wouldn't need to dedicate so much attention to this issue. So I'm pleased to introduce our panelists. We have Ben Siddle, who is the Climate Action Policy Lead at the Department of Foreign Affairs for the Government of Ireland. We have Vaughan, who's the Head of Influence and Advocacy Workstream for Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, and is based at Mercy Corps. We have Michael Szoenyi, the Flood Resilience Program Lead at Zurich Insurance Company. Yolande Wright, the Global Director for Child Poverty, Climate and Urban at Save the Children International, and Clare Shakya, Director of Climate Change, the Climate Change Group at the International Institute for Environment and Development. And I just want to check, we had one more panelist who is going to join, Nicky Batang-ay from Tebtebba, but it sounded like he had very bad weather conditions that he was confronting that might have disrupted his internet access. So I just want to quickly check if Nicky is here. Please turn on your camera and join us, because we're anxious to hear your reflections if you are able to join. So Benno, I want to start with you and hear your perspective as a bilateral, as a funder of a lot of local endeavors, a lot of adaptation endeavors. What was the discussion like for you and your colleagues in considering these principles? And how do you see them as useful to you and your mission?
Thanks. Thank you very much, and delighted to be here. Hello, everyone. I think the discussion around this didn't take up too much time. And I'll give some backdrop to that. In our program for government and in our international development policy, we have a commitment to double the percentage of our ODA that counts as climate finance by 2030. The overwhelming majority of that climate finance is for adaptation, and we have a focus on the LDCs. So when these principles born out of the LDC vision were put to us, they chimed very nicely with the clear need to focus as we increase our own quantity of climate finance and hope to leverage others to do the same, to look more closely and harder at the quality of that finance. And I think these principles underpin the kind of processes and programming and learning that'll help us get there, because it's clearly something of a travesty if only 10% of climate finance is reaching the local level. You know, we would have to have a very serious look at our role as a bilateral donor embedded in the international system and the international bureaucracy of aid, if that situation were to continue while we you know, prioritize climate action to the extent that we do. So I think these principles are very exciting for that reason. They are born out of discussions, analysis, and ownership of the LDCs themselves. And as I said, we have a focus on our partnership with the LDCs and a climate justice focus in our climate diplomacy. So that really resonated as well. I think the SDGs that, of course, Ireland was heavily involved in chairing the process on, the SDGs do challenge us to think subnationally more in terms of multi-sectoriality and multi-stakeholder approaches. And there's been a lot of discussions and programming and policy work on that internationally. So I think these principles kind of chime very nicely with that, and the opportunity to work on that missing middle. A very nice catchphrase, because of course, you know, we, through our bilateral aid program, fund some very excellent islands of excellence at local level, and we engage heavily at national level on policy. But there's this holy grail of connecting it all up and of leveraging everyone's alignment around the end goal. And I think the principles will help with that too. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for that that context that helps us see it from your perspective and hear what's helpful and what's motivating to you. I kind of want to ask the same question to you, Yolande, from Save the Children's perspective. It's an organization working on children's issues. How did these resonate with you, and how do you see them as helping with your ongoing and future programming?
Thank you. Well, I think, again, it wasn't a huge debate because we saw it as a really good fit for us. We're obviously a child rights organisation, and we've got increasingly involved in in climate action, because this is such a huge child rights issue. Children, sort of the least responsible for the situation they're finding themselves in, are at the very front end. And we've really appreciated the work of IIED and others that have really highlighted how little finance is reaching the most vulnerable children, the most vulnerable communities, including children. And we keep seeing, every time we see the data from disasters, 80% of those displaced are women and children. Why? Well, this is because of these structural inequalities that you're talking about in Principle 2. And we definitely see that from the communities that we're working with. Their voice isn't always heard at sort of national level debates. So these principles have really resonated well with us, and we've discussed it from our humanitarian colleagues who are there responding when crises strike, as well as our development colleagues who want to be building resilience and adaptive capacity. So in sort of broad terms, we think these principles fit really well. And we really loved things like the focus on addressing power imbalances, because we think that there's no sort of social justice without kind of climate justice, and they're so intertwined. And the fact that we're consistently seeing the worst effects of extreme events on poorer communities wherever we are in the world, and this applies in London or the northeast of England as much as it does in Bangladesh or in Somalia, that the communities with the least financial capacity to purchase insurance or to change where their houses are situated, slum dwellers who are having to live on floodplains because they need to be close to their places of work, but they can't afford the sort of housing that is in the city centre. It all resonates really well for us and our work. So I don't want to cover all of the principles, but just very broadly, we felt that they resonated really well with what we want to do. And I think, it also provides us with some real challenges. And I'll just briefly, this whole decolonizing of aid, and here I am as a white privileged woman in a Western country talking to you about locally led adaptation. But I think, we're thinking very hard as an NGO about what decolonizing development means and how do we put more power directly into the hands of people. And I think these set of principles speak directly to that as well. And we're trying to do more and more programming directly with local communities, giving much more direct cash transfers directly to households where they can make the choices. So I think I'll stop there, but I hope that gives you a kind of swathe of how these resonate in multiple ways with us as an institution. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Yolande, and thanks for highlighting also some of the challenges and the new mechanisms that you're thinking about using to really bring that down to the local level and give that determination to local level actors. And thank you for bringing your perspective. I think it helped us recognize the need to recognize children as part of the group that needs to have more agency. Children and youth need to have more of a voice and determination in these processes. And I want to go to you next for Mercy Corps' perspective. You're working all over the world, doing some really interesting work on adaptation and humanitarian disaster risk reduction, et cetera. But just to pick up on Yolande's point on the difficulties, how do you see implementing this and ensuring that there is local agency, local determination that Mercy Corps can support?
Sure, no, thanks. And really just wanted to appreciate the work that you, Cristina, have done in WRI and IIED in a consultative process. You guys were practicing what you're preaching in bringing together the principles and actually engaging and having a thorough consultation. So I think that sort of underpins the work that we all need to do to be consultative and to engage civil society and to have the backing, I think, of some progressive donors on thinking about how to do that, because that underpins everything that, how we move forward and to make sure that they are consultative. So kudos to you guys. And I hope we can replicate this type of consultation in other ways too, not just on how the incredibly important point of getting funding and decision-making down to local levels, but in other sectors across the board outside of climate change too. We see this as, and we're real enthusiastic. Again, it was an easy yes to sign on to the principles, because as we look at our localization agenda and the urgency of climate change, you have to frame this, and a bit of what Yolande was talking about is the context of we have to shift power. which is sometimes not an easy thing to do. It's a political issue, but we have to shift power not only within our own agency, but a broader sector and then society at large. And that can be, that's hard to do. So we have been developing some of our own internal management policies, including on how do we make sure that we are more diverse. Again, seconding, I'm a white American woman speaking on this, but we are actively working on how do we make sure that we have better leadership, more diverse leadership at the highest levels and down to community levels, and the communities that we work in are being able to feed in more into decision making and policies and practices. We, as part of, it's hard. There's so many good principles. Some of the ones that I thought are the most interesting to speak on maybe today is through some of our work through the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, and Michael will speak more on this from Zurich Insurance. But helping make sure that funding at local levels actually gets distributed and goes and reaches down to the lowest level. So we're really proud of some of the work that we've been able to do, being very intentional about identifying budget gaps and then advocating, often in coalition, because you need to get a lot of people on board to change politics at different levels, to help increase the amount of disaster risk reduction that goes down to community levels. So we've had some success in Nepal on this, where working with municipalities and again, identifying how much is being spent, which is sometimes not easy to find, and then advocating about why you need to address those gaps, so that some municipalities have agreed to 5% of their budgets going to DRR. Now, doing that requires budget transparency. That is something and it's principle 6 or 7, excuse me, as my personal favorite, because in order to be able to do a lot of this, you need transparency, and we need help from governments, and we need help from donors to help push for some of that. And I think if we're all resilient systems thinkers here, we have to sort of put that system thinker on, stop just talking to ourselves amongst the climate community, but reach out more broadly, talk to our governance friends, get diplomats involved, heck, to have these conversations at broader levels to help be able to increase that transparency so we can track the money and do all that good work IIED is asking us to do over the years, so we can actually see where the money flows and make sure that the gaps are addressed so that people at the local levels actually have access to funds and the funds are there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. It's great to hear you already have a favorite principle. Michael, I want to turn to you next. You're coming from a private sector organization, company, Zurich Insurance. And to be honest, we weren't sure we'd get many private sector organizations endorsing in this first line. We do have a couple, and are really, really excited to have Zurich championing this. But I'd love to hear from your perspective as a private sector company. How do you see these principles, and how do you see supporting locally led adaptation action through your mechanisms?
Certainly, Cristina. And first of all, thanks for having me. It's a real privilege to be part of the panel and representing Zurich Insurance. So yeah, again, I think it was quite easy to sign on, and the content wasn't contested at all from the principles. Maybe more so it was a bit the sign-on process and making sure, given we are a global company, that everybody could sign off. And as Anne was saying, we need leadership. So for us, it was really important that we do have the C-suite level ambassadorship behind endorsing these principles. Now at Zurich, we feel that being a responsible and sustainable business is really at the heart of what we do, and the insurance industry specifically needs to lead by example in this regard. Now, Zurich is a direct insurance company, so we work directly with private people and small companies, small and mid-sized enterprises as our insureds. And from climate models and projections, but already from losses that are occurring, we know it is, the most vulnerable. It is, the local people at the coastline, along the rivers, in remote areas that are and will be affected the most. And that's why it is clearly, in our very interest, serving our customers and protecting them from risk, that, the local principles really hold true for us. And looking through these principles, I think for us, it was good to find examples of what we are already doing. And I think we'll be coming to this a little later in the panel. So that already is almost a proof point that, these principles can and will be endorsed by us and by the sector, hopefully. And where we're not already doing it, we're definitely finding a clear vision of how we can, well, actually we have an ambition for some of these principles, and we have a vision of how we can make these ambitions a reality. So that really speaks to the principles for ourselves.
Thanks, Michael. Claire, I want to turn it over to you to hear about from a research institution's perspective. I know we together have had a lot of discussions on this, but what is the role of research institutions in supporting the application of these principles? How can A, what do we need to do differently, and B, how can we support all of the different sorts of entities that we heard about today that have a role to play in shifting from business as usual to business unusual?
Thanks, Cristina. It's wonderful to be here and so exciting just on the eve of the Climate Adaptation Summit, where we will be, setting out the vision of some of those that have endorsed and just really trying to roll up our sleeves, because the principles themselves have been derived from good practice, from what we've seen. And I guess that's part of the role of the research community, is to look across the experiences of different organizations and say, how does this all add up? What is going to be truly transformational? Or what are the signs of transformation? And then why are they looking so good? And so these principles actually derive from all of your experience, the audience here and beyond. I guess the sort of fundamental is it's not going to be easy. The system is for the current system for supporting climate action just isn't working well enough. There isn't trust in climate finance, and as others have mentioned, it's just not getting to where it matters most. And we know, as others have said, that it's vital to give agency to local actors because they understand their context and they understand how to invest in resilience that's going to have greatest impact. So I guess the opportunity for us on the research side, but also for all of those in the delivery side, is around understanding how to reform the system so it really does start to work. So the learning journey, I think, is critical. It's not about just saying, right, we've signed up and we'll do what we can, but it's actually about really exploring each other's practice and understanding what innovations by Zurich might apply to Mercy Corps, might apply to IIED's work. It's us collectively holding each other to account, but also us collectively trying to improve our practice. I love that Anne's favourite is meaningful transparency. I think it is going to be really vital that we're transparent, not just in how we express our how we're passing funds on, what funds we're receiving, how we pass it on. Also around the governance of decisions, but it's going beyond that, the transparency of our learning as well. So we just published a brief on trust in climate finance requiring meaningful transparency, and it shows the intentions of well, we look basically at trying to understand the intentions of commitments for adaptation finance for the least developed countries. And for only 15% of the climate finance commitments of bilaterals could we really understand what they'd intended to achieve by making that investment. And that's compared to 88% by multilaterals. And then when you look at those that you could, you look at that range of experience, of the 17 billion adaptation investment to the LDCs that we were looking at, only 6 billion of that had adaptation as a primary objective. Now that tells us something about, actually, if we're going to really change the system, we're not even very clear with ourselves or with others what our objectives are. So there is a lot of good practice in improving, in the quality of information that's provided by different donors. And if we're able to bring that together and apply it consistently, it'd be much easier to hold the donors to account, the delivery partners that they work with, but also really understand what works and learn much more rapidly. I think the other aspect that's really vital to think about, I'll touch on principle 8, is how we connect together. So we've committed to try and align with national and partners' priorities, with their initiatives, work with what their priorities are, connecting levels and actors to build a collaborative system. And I think within the Life AR initiative of the LDC group, that's another, they're trying to build a collaboration with the donors. They're trying to develop delivery systems that incentivize collaboration between national and local governments, between local governments and communities. and really understand how to invest behind local level priorities for climate action. So there is some, some really exciting work out there by those that are endorsing these principles and beyond. And if we can bring that together, we can start to really improve practice overall. Thanks, Cristina.
Thanks, Claire. I just want to quickly check and see if Nicky's online, because we do want to hear from him and get again a different perspective if he is able to speak to these issues, which I see coming up in some of the chat messages. Dan, I'm going to turn to you next, and in this next round of questions, I want to get a little bit tougher on the how, on what we do differently, and how we confront the challenges that we know we can't be naive. We know there are challenges to implementing these principles and shifting practice and shifting incentives and the level of transparency that Claire is mentioning. So Ben, if you wouldn't mind touching on it from your perspective, what's going to be hard for this, and what do you think can be done to really put these into practice for Irish Aid?
Thank you. Yes, I'll speak very much from a kind of donor perspective as part of our government machinery here in Ireland. So I'll pick out from the principles. I'll pick out three that we're going to have to grapple with. We will be endorsing these principles, Minister Brophy, at the Climate Adaptation Summit Tuesday morning. But nonetheless, as you say, it isn't all plain sailing. So principle 3 around long-term predictable financing, it's not that we don't get it, but our systems are such that our ODA is allocated and approved and allocated on an annual basis by Parliament. So legally, it's very difficult to sign up, legally binding memorandums of understanding or agreements that are multi-annual. So that's relates also, I suppose, to Principle 7, accountability, and folks have touched on this a bit. Fundamentally, we're accountable to the taxpayers through Parliament, and that makes the devolution of money and decision making. It needs to be well thought through, and we need to be learning that stuff as we go, and we definitely want the lessons there. It kind of stymied the localization agenda, which of course it was in the Grand Bargain at the World Humanitarian Summit. We were at that and arguing for that, and we're keen on this, but it isn't easy given our own sort of democratic structures that we work in. But I do believe that we can't hide behind a sort of capacity arguments. We need to grapple with those capacity arguments. So, but working off these principles, initiatives like Life AR that together with the UK, Ireland has been supporting the establishment of, and that Claire just mentioned, I think that offers us a way to grapple constructively in order to resolve this at national and subnational levels. And then possibly just touch on its Principle 6, which talks about sort of flexibility and adaptive management. And it's sort of linked to the accountability issue, but just to sort of explain that it's not always the sexiest sell within our political system to talk about sort of learning journeys and that what can look like a leap of faith, that you're sort of funding the unknown, pegged to learning. But traditionally, it's of course far easier to stand over funding proven concepts. But therein lies the opportunity, much like I talked about Life AR in relation to accountability and learning. The learning in general, if we can reframe as donors the kind of results agenda to be inclusive of a learning agenda, if we can fund knowledge as well as impact and free up our partners to do that more, then I think that would be hugely progressive, and hence our support for the Life AR program, which we are committed to long term, even if we have to sign the annual agreements, as I said. So it's really those points, and that would be, I don't know, hopefully some useful context from a bilateral donor perspective. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for being honest about those constraints. You're certainly not the only one, I'm sure, in that and facing similar constraints, and it helps us identify where we need to focus that joined up learning journey to address those particular bottlenecks and challenges. And I want to go to you next to kind of ask the same question. What's going to be difficult about this for Mercy Corps? You know, change is always hard. What are the changes you anticipate being a bit difficult that you actually want some help with from a community of practice?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And it kind of builds off of what Ben was just saying. And I, again, appreciate the honesty, Ben, because, and I feel like we often have a circular argument between advocates for greater we call it more, I don't know how many times I've said we need more flexible funding to a donor, line item budget flexibility, support adaptive management, let us learn, let us iterate. And you have a legislative body that oversees where your funding goes, and it's hard to push through or give 7-year funding. I love in the principles that there's an advocating for 7-year funding. Like that's great. We got to get specific on our side to be able to help our bilateral friends and donors to be able to help get us to be able to implement the principles and get over those hurdles that we face, which come to lack of risk by donors to let us change and be able to have an open relationship with a donor when something's not working, to be able to go back and say, we got to fix something. So that sort of iterative process is really hard to get past the political system in donor capitals. But so I think it's also on us to be able to demonstrate why we need to do that. So I'd like to flag, so right now the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, it's funded by the Zurich Foundation and has given us that flexibility. It's from a foundation versus a donor, but there's some really good lessons that we can hopefully show some of the impact. When you give us this flexibility, when you partner with us in truly helpful ways, we will be able to do the following things. So just sort of flagging that, and we're putting out a report alongside the principles on Tuesday that sort of dig into what let us be able to have some of the successes that we've had on the ground through the Alliance work around some of these can be somewhat nebulous flexible funding things. So for us, the biggest challenge on going to scale on implementing some of these principles would both be helping, some of the donor constraints and the big institutional ones. Really, and then I would rather, instead of some of the bilateral donors can be even more flexible than some of our friends in the multilateral system. We really need reform through the DCF. Some of the other multilaterals, the multilateral banks are huge pots of money and control a ton of money that shapes local people's lives every day. Getting that in those systems and continuing to engage with those multilaterals to make sure that they are absorbing these things, I think would help not just us sort of implement them, but be transformational in helping actually advance some of the adaptation work that we need.
Mm-hmm. There are some signs of promise there, but again, a role that governments have to play with their institutional roles with those development banks to advance this agenda. Yolande, I want to turn to you to get your perspective on this. What's going to be hard for Save the Children in implementing these principles? How do you see kind of getting to scale with locally led adaptation? And again, what are the challenges that you need help from others to address? And that others could be any one of us entities represented here.
Thanks. I won't repeat the challenges that Anne mentioned, because I think any NGO or anyone looking for funding has probably similar constraints. With we've actually been accredited to the Green Climate Fund, but are at the, it's for more than a year already been trying to kind of get through the processes that are needed, and it's certainly not a journey that's easy, even for a well-resourced, in inverted commas, powerful international NGO. So certainly we feel those constraints, but I won't repeat them. One of the things that I will mention, though, is on the devolved decision making. I do think we need to go on a journey of trusting local communities and local people, and we just have to confront that head on. And I'll give an example of some funding that has been very flexible for us that we've used in Somalia, but we can't do more of this without more flexibility. So we've been given some flexibility from a donor in Somalia to set up a kind of crisis modifier that goes alongside some of our cash transfer programming. And we've got local communities, really village level groups that have got a proportion of women in them that we've had to sort of struggle to get agreed, where they agree the triggers. They're literally monitoring their local river, and that when there's, and as you all know, linked to climate, there's more extreme rainfall, some big flood events just this year in Somalia, alongside drought, you know, so it's not always expected in people's minds that they're dealing with flooding in Somalia. But when the rivers reach certain levels, we had an agreement this year that the local community then were able to trigger some additional finance from the crisis modifier we had, and within 6 days we got cash straight out directly to families, and they could make their decisions about how they you know, coped and how they adapted to that rising river situation, the flash floods. And that was a really, I think, a really strong example of what's possible, but it required donors giving some flexible funding that could be triggered at local level, not with national level triggers and international NASA data, but local river measurements. And what I think the digital transformation will give us is much more power to say, we can tell you what they spent it on. We provide that money to mobile wallets, right? To mobile phones. Then we can monitor what they're spending it on. And if you really need to know that they spend it on this much food and that much construction materials to rebuild their houses and that much school, you know, stuff to help their kids get back to school, we can provide that data and look at it. But we do need a bit of trust to allow, you know, to kind of give local people that power. The second thing is on a link to the sort of addressing power dynamics is we've found with some really interesting projects we've tried to do involving children that often their voice is really ignored. And this is from projects in places like Bangladesh where children kept asking for bridges to be built to enable them to get to school in the wet season in Bangladesh, where the rivers flood every single year, but to different extents. And, you know, often their voice wasn't the most important, you know, and actually, when you think about it, children missing school, we should all really be empathizing with this now with COVID. Children missing school for several weeks and months a year is actually a catastrophe for those children, because we all know that the children who are missing out the most are those who don't have the laptops, they don't have the Wi-Fi, they don't have the mobile phones. And so we're also worried in the West about our kids now who are not in school. We should be listening to children's voices wherever they are in the world about what is a local disaster for them and what adaptation do they want. And we've got some new partnerships with Google, again, you know, providing us with a bit of flexible funding where we're testing in Indonesia, schools and local communities doing weather monitoring and combining that with climate data to get kind of almost sort of like locally sourced information to help deal with kind of what kind of adaptation should they be doing right there in those villages in Indonesia. And so I think there's some like digital data connectivity provides us with some wonderful opportunities, but it does also require some flexibility from donors to trust local people with their money, and to then, you know, actually digital will allow us to monitor it, but we have to let people use the money in the way they see fit. So I hope that's some useful, tangible examples of what we're trying to do.
That's great, Yolande, thank you. And the issue of trust keeps coming back up and up, and trust means sometimes failing and things not going the right way, but learning from that. Michael, I'm going to turn to you next, but just for the audience's sake, we're going to go to questions from you in just a minute. So be thinking of those, putting them in the chat room or raising your hands. Michael, I'm thinking about you from a private sector perspective and hearing about learning journeys and trust, and I'm just curious, how do you see this from Zurich Insurance perspectives? The issue of being part of a learning journey, the issue of developing that trust at various levels and everything that implies. Is that going to be difficult? Does that sound a bit crazy to you, or is it something else?
So maybe I need to answer this question in two strands. One from the flood resilience program that has been mentioned, and more kind of the the donor side, as well as the implementation side of this development program, which is what we're doing. And then secondly, looking at this from a business angle in terms of insurance, insurability, and how this plays in the wider disaster risk reduction field. So firstly, from the flood resilience program, I think I probably need to answer this in terms of, what has been hard, what is still hard, and, what is going to be hard to implement going forward. And I was saying, because we already have examples speaking to some of these principles, I think we can really quote, what already has been done and what has been hard. So we do have a bit of a learning journey here. So the program's been running from 2013, and I think the first thing that comes to mind, what has been hard is really setting this up. So if you want to have this co-creation, this collaborative approach of building a program together that is flexible, you really need to understand your partners, you need to trust your partners, and you need to bring them to the table and develop the strategy, theory of change, etc. together, rather than impose a request for proposal. This is what we expect from you, and then please, implement. And that leads to the question, when does a program actually start? So we've been working since 2013, probably a bit more in the request for proposal stage originally, and then we, did the co-creation as we went along. And this was a flexible 5-year program in the sense that we didn't really know where we would end up as we started, and we're not imposing specific solutions or pieces to be implemented from our implementing experts, but rather what we really focus on is this problem analysis, engaging with the communities, understanding the strengths and weaknesses, bringing the tools to the table so this problem analysis can be done. And then in year 2, 3, maybe 4 of the program, that's where you start implementing, because you know what you want to do. So setting this up is the hard thing. And I said, you don't really know when the program starts really, because you probably need 6 months, if not a year, of a preparation phase where you already need to fund your program, obviously, but you haven't really started. So I think that's an interesting question for donors to ask. If you want more co-creation, when can you start providing some funding, and when is the program actually starting, as opposed to a preparation phase? What is still being, difficult for us is then following through on this in very practical terms. So I think, our program probably runs very differently for some of our implementing partners alongside other donors that they need to satisfy. So the reporting is different, the implementation is really different, and that doesn't always make it easy to, support the local people that do the work on the ground to say, no, you don't need to take something off the shelf that, you can do, but it's maybe not fit for the purpose. You can create a new solution. You can take your time, and we don't need to know now. We can know later as you complete your problem analysis, and providing them that reassurance. And I think that's then the trust in the other direction, making sure we can be trusted. Yes, the funding will be there in 3 years, and yes, you have the flexibility to propose new solutions, maybe even unproven solutions, rather than taking off the established but not fixing the problem piece, a solution from the shelf. Also, what is being hard at the moment still is then, this kind of, duality of short and long time frames. We can't necessarily, bring results until we've done the 5-year phase completely. Whereas, some of our people we need to be accountable to internally. And I think that's where we're closing the loop with, C-level suite ambassadorship and their trust. They want short-term results in the business. Well, probably they want short-term results, on their, charitable arm as well. And we really need to, have convincing arguments to tell them, go away, don't ask these questions again, or, well, you can ask these questions again, but you don't really get replies until that year 3, 4, 5, as we are in the program. So making sure we have that trust and, we are convincing enough that they can trust us, we deliver results in the longer term. So that's the program. And then from a business side, I think as an insurer, we need to make sure our business proposals are fit for the local people, more and more, especially in the climate change situation as well. And I believe, we need to move the sector more towards those more integrated approaches where we bring risk awareness, risk education, risk modeling, whatever it may be, in addition to the product. I think we're still very often too much focused on the product. There's a lot of initiatives going on at the moment. If you look at Insure Resilience, if you look at the Insurance Development Forum, but I think it always starts with, well, we have certain products that we can offer. Where is the gap where our product will close it? But I think we need to start much more asking the question beyond the product. What can we really do to support the wider society? Because ultimately, what I always say is that a risk transferred is not yet a risk reduced. So we need to be integrating the wider aspects of DRR and bring then, the insurance product at a later stage.
Thanks, Michael. That's a great reminder and a great reflection that it is about the early stage process and building that trust and building that learning and giving time for that, but also ensuring that we're delivering long-term results that are durable and build that capacity locally to manage those risks on an ongoing basis. So it's not just all a projectized sort of approach. I want to quickly turn to the audience. We have a few minutes for Q&A, and I think a really interesting side chat going on in the chat function on the issue of failure and what words we can use that might enable us to think about failure and learning and experimentation together with donors that might be more palatable. But let me just see if anyone wants to jump in. Please either raise your hand or just come off mute. I think we're a small enough group here today to let people jump into the conversation. Michael.
Can I make a quick remark? I was scrolling through some of the comments and questions and the learning piece and the failure element, I think I want to pick up on for two reasons. One, I always firmly believed in this, and that's also where the flexibility and the trust comes in. We need to provide a certain space to allow failures to happen, not repeatedly and obviously not fundamentally. You can't fail an entire, 10-year, 50 million program. But in terms of, finding out which solutions work and which don't work and which are not, working in the right context. I think we need a better culture of learning and allowing failures to take place and then implementing, amendments to not repeating these mistakes. And secondly, I think this is starting to be visible in, donor agencies and bilateral agencies a bit more as well. And I think the former head of the Swiss Development Corporation, who has just been replaced by a new person, but he was also a firm believer of that. And we've had a couple of conversations in this regard. And I think, we need to see more of that, allowing a certain, sandbox in which experimenting and failing can take place, because then it will profit the wider program that you're carrying out.
Thanks for that. I really like the way you talked about it in terms of problem driven and having this phase of analysis and iteration as a way of learning and building that trust and maybe failing, but it's really just learning. I don't know, Claire, did you want to come in on that? I saw your hand go up there.
Yeah, well, I guess the challenge, I think, is very much on this issue around framing results and success in different ways. So if we can begin to express our intentions to build a system that will eventually have much more impact, and that requires testing and experimenting, then the experimentation process is valid and we can justify it. But I think the whole way that we're talking about results at the moment in terms of end impact is perhaps part of the problem. We need to think more about the process to build the delivery mechanisms, get the architecture right, begin to build that local capability that allows communities to understand the impacts of climate change, know how to draw in expertise from local government or other partners. And there's also something around pace that quite often we are offering huge results at very short timescales because we think that's going to win us the bid. And the donors are sort of buying into that and saying, okay, the ones that are going to deliver most results by tomorrow are definitely the best. but actually recognizing that to build an institutional mechanism that really functions and really engages community voices takes a long time. And the pace may be fast at times, but slow at others. And if we could begin to express our results, our success in ways that recognize the challenges of doing this type of work that we've set out in these principles, maybe we'll begin to have a different debate about what the purpose of the finance is and how best to manage it for outcomes that actually leave that institutional legacy that we've been talking about.
Exactly. And the point about short-term results, if we keep focusing on the short term, we're never going to build resilience. We're going to have some nice outputs, but never the outcomes that we want, which are much longer term in nature. Vincent, I see you kind of raising a hand there. Do you want to come in on this point?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, thanks, Cristina. Hi, everybody. Really good to see you all and great discussion. I mean, I think it's really about the issue of failure and sort of coming from a donor perspective. You know, we work in a very conservative with a small c environment in which cost effectiveness and value for money are really stressed, accountability to the taxpayer. There's a lot of issues, you know, a lot of expectation of success. So a lot of expectation that the money is going to be spent in the most cost effective way and deliver according to defined milestones over a defined time period. Now, we've got a lot of learning to do as a donor in that sort of environment. I mean, we are funding Life AR, we are committing to the LLA, we're changing the way that we do things as a result of that approach. The previous BRACE program, which many of you know, had crisis modifiers, had you know, ways of responding at quite short notice to quite difficult and complex circumstances, particularly say in the Western Sahel, where, you know, we had a lot of issues around conflict and things like that, which were impacting on program delivery. So we've learned about flexibility, we've learned about, I suppose, toleration of failure. I suppose you could call it toleration, but I think it's also, I think Ben mentioned it as well, it's about risk appetite. It's about being sure of defining your risk appetite at the outset, having a clear understanding with your delivery partners, with your local partners about risk appetite and about the kind of risk matrix that you're working on together. And then, I suppose, bringing it as quickly as possible to the head so that you're not dealing with an issue that looks like it's been swept under the carpet, but has been dealt with honestly through the lifetime of the project. When a situation changes very quickly on the ground, we want to have a conversation around that. We understand, like COVID at the moment, it's having a massive impact on our programming, a massive impact on the way that we're able to spend money and account for that money. But we're having the conversation with our delivery partners and being able to at least therefore modify the way that we expect that accountability to be delivered to us. So it stops being a failure. It becomes a process of joint learning, a process of accommodation of changing circumstances. We're not there yet. As I say, we have to report to our ministers, to our taxpayers, and we have to balance off those expectations. But I think we're on that, we're on that journey at the moment as well. And I'd like to sort of, I suppose, give some reassurance that this is something that we are very much taking on board and working together, particularly with initiatives like Life AR and working together with IIED and the LDC group on that. So thanks. Thanks,
Vincent. Thanks for jumping into the conversation. We're running a little bit late on time, and I don't want to take any time away from our local voices. I want to turn now to Mr. Kazi Ahmad Hook from Friendship, who I must point out, Friendship is a Bangladesh-based NGO who were the actual first organization to endorse the principles for locally led adaptation. So Kazi is the Director of Strategic Planning and Head of Climate Action at Friendship. And I'd like to turn to you to hear your perspective from the communities that you serve and that you work with. What have you heard today that you think you will take with us that inspires you in terms of seeing, yes, we are going to be able to get more support for locally led adaptation, but also what do you feel is missing that we still need to work on?
Thank you, Cristina. It's a great opportunity to share my voice. But actually, last 1 hour, I was thinking, all we had the same words, but different, our reflection, articulation, or expression. Truly speaking, that is friendship working last 20 years in the coastal belt in country, and at the same time, the local island, I mean, Chor areas, Chor is Bangla word is Senbar Island. So every years the geographic scenario changing. So we have to find a way, we have to find option for better tomorrow with the community. And the community, our whole actions are very much participatory process, actually engaging community in assessment, planning, and actions. But we were doing the way we need to do. But the local adaptation principles, actually, when we are in crossroad, what is LLA and what is not, that these principles actually gave us a direction. And I understand that direction itself is spirit. I mean, you can base on something to take you forward, to take your action forward. And that principle, in that perspective, helping a lot, helped a lot. And I understand, on way to our, I mean, destination, there are plenty challenges, plenty critical issues. What we learned this session, actually. First of all, actually, when I was traveling, virtually, when I was in the session, at the same time, I was virtually traveling in my communities. And I was thinking about the, for the adaptation, local adaptation, first challenge is a nowadays is a technology. We need to transfer our technology to the people in need. And in the whole world, there are plenty ideas came up, and technology is a solution. And we need to find a way how we can transfer at least technology to the community people so that they can find, they can use their ideas to live better. And then immediate after that, actually, I understand that for adaptation and last several years experience, we realize has a limit. This year what you did, the next year is really is inadequate. So always the adaptation, we must need a backup mechanism, backup support. This year you may identify community well, fine, they're doing very well, but next year they may fall in crisis. And so that backup needed to make sure they are in progress, they keep continuing their spirit, they keep continuing their the learning. So that transition is truly important. We introduced transition fund in Bangladesh actually for the people, those who are really climate impacted, and to take them to the development highway. In between, there is a really critical gap. And to address this critical gap, very hardly someone coming forward, because they are hopeless. They are landless for some people. But to us, they should have remained. They should remain with hope and dignity, with their challenges, with their crisis, with their learning. And then what I actually learned from this discussion is a role clarification. For this local adaptation principle, we need to clarify role. There are, for my community, to reach my community, there are plenty stakeholders, the government, the donors, and the respective technical agencies, community, and many. So, and scientists. So we need to very clearly define our role. And here, Save the Children, Mercy Corps, and there are many other agencies here at to this session. We need to define in Bangladesh or in communities, wherever you are in the world, what would be the role for you as an international organization, as UN organization, as donor, as government, as very implementing organization. And because we understand adaptation is an ever evolving process. So keeping this in mind, we can't stop ourselves. So I'm not really frustrated with the very challenges what I just learned. Rather, is a to me, it's the journey, it's the beginning of a new dimension. So always, whatever changes in this world, came up, all took so many, efforts. So this beginning was needed. And I truly appreciate the people, colleagues, friends who were involved in this development process. I believe in the climate summit, we'll find new Moderator, to take these principles forward, to unfold these principles. And this is all about my feeling. One last but not least, that is whatever we have at this moment, as a Save the Children, as the government, as Mercy Corps, whatever, as an academician, as a scientist, we can we can start working with that resources. We can start with that decision making process. Within my little jurisdiction, I have a decision making process. I can work with my sixth sector, friendship, working with around 300 to 400 islands. Friendship last in October, we organized around 300 local organizations and organized a dialogue through a webinar, and the minister secretary were there. And one local health tract organization, they raised the issue. Immediately, minister actually taken action. He said, "Oh, I didn't know that, so we should change our policy." So you never know when it will click. So that within us, let's start the journey. Let's rework, reframe within us first, and then connects our dots for a better tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazi. Incredibly eloquent and so much there that's hard to unpack. But really, this issue of the limits to adaptation, the need for investing in transition, but also just starting with where you are. That resilience is a journey. Resilience is about learning. It is about adapting over time and evolving, and that requires a lot of iterations, but we need to start with where we have with the decision making processes we're a part of, defining those roles and moving from there in partnership. And so thank you very much for those remarks and for taking us to the chars of Bangladesh, figuratively and with your photo as well. I'm afraid that actually concluded everything in terms of put everything together so succinctly. But I want to take us back to the slides for just one or two conclusion remarks and really just to say thank you to everyone for spending the time to being a part of this conversation. It doesn't end here. It doesn't end with the Climate Adaptation Summit on Monday and Tuesday next week. This is really a journey, and I think we've had a taste of that journey and that discussion today, both with the panel and also in the chat box. And Emma, if you could just go to that slide. I really want to invite everyone on this call, your friends and others who you think might be interested, to join us on this learning journey. There's a lot to be done. We of course want to expand the number of endorsing institutions and people signing up to the principles. But I think more importantly, I think we need to identify collectively what are the specific reforms that will ratchet up the level of ambition and impact over time, to keep each other accountable, to learn together, to be able to come up with the arguments that are needed to help convince donors, multilaterals, and others to change what are often very entrenched ways of working, for good reasons, into a different way of working. So this is a journey. It will continue. We will have dialogues at the community-based adaptation meeting, at COP, at Gobeshona. Gobeshona will annually, as Salima said, be now virtual and have a theme of locally led adaptation. So this is a very important continuing dialogue. And finally, I want to invite everyone to join us for the locally led adaptation anchor event on Tuesday, January 26th, from 8 to 10 a.m. GMT. You can register at the website that's on the slide right now. I do encourage everyone to register now if you want to attend, because this event is being very close to being oversubscribed. I think there's already 9,000 people registered and a limit of 10,000, unless they're able to increase the maximum again, which they've already had to do. So do register. The event will be hosted by the Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina of Bangladesh. You'll hear about many interesting and notable initiatives to take forward locally led adaptation, and hear about what are the organizations, the first wave of organizations that are supporting these principles and endorsing these principles. So with that, I'll say thank you. A big thank you to our panelists. A big thank you to our co-organizers and partners in this at IIED, and really to everyone who joined in and was an active part of this conversation. It doesn't end here. So please do be in touch if you have further questions or want to be included in future conversations. Thanks everyone, and have a
Cristina,
good
in a
evening.
second, I would request everyone to
Yeah.
watch our film, Climate Resilient World, Building a
Thank
Climate
you, Cassie.
in
Oh.
Cast Cinema.
Yeah, in cinema. So the cast will also have a cinema with various films. Do you have a link to the film, Cassie?
I gave
Or-
already in
It's
chat
in the
box.
chat box, Cristina.
Great.
Yeah.
It's in the chat box. Great. Yeah, so please do take a look at that. That's
Please.
great.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.